Every enterprise has a network that's almost like a snowflake, and many of them have individual snowflakes inside of them. When you deal with a network, you're still at the most fundamental level dealing with voltage on a wire. And that provides limitations around how you fail over, and it makes you think through things a little bit more deeply than you need to. You've got to be able to say 80% is enough. It gets me to where I have to go, and then harden your operational process around what's actually achievable.
Welcome to the Enterprise Thought Leadership Podcast, where we explore the latest in enterprise trends, tech, and strategy with the top leaders shaping the future.
Welcome to Enterprise Unlocked. I'm your host, Radhika Mukherjee, Editor-in-Chief of IT Security Wire. Our guest today is Ernest Lefner, Chief Product Officer at Gluware. Ernest brings over 20 years of IT leadership experience in financial services to his role as Chief Product Officer at Gluware. He has held a variety of roles, including 13 plus years building and leading the Fidelity Investments Network, product management, and cybersecurity engineering organizations. He spent 5 years as a change agent driving transformation at Bank of America, where he most notably built the network, voice, and security architecture. Welcome to the podcast, Ernest.
Right, thank you very much. You're very kind in your description. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. And I'm sure this will be one of the most interesting conversations in cybersecurity today.
Hands down.
Hands down, absolutely. So let's actually set the stage for the audience. The network remains the least automated and most vulnerable layer in enterprise security. This is at a time when Mythos-class AI is capable of exposing security gaps faster than ever before, especially at the network level. Ernest, tell us about the role of the network layer in the modern enterprise, and in particular, enterprise security.
Well, that's a great question. The network has evolved. It used to be kind of a tangential, nice to have back 25 years ago. And as e-commerce grew, and then we grew into the cloud, and data centers became more and more important, the way commerce is delivered around the planet, the way we communicate, all sits on top of the network now. And unfortunately, a lot of that technology is ancient, right? We're still using the same types of interfaces, the same types of components that we used 25, 30 years ago. Now that we are moving into the AI era, where it's kind of an amalgamation of all of the different problems that we've had in many different industries, all wrapped in one, we have to rethink our approach there.
Yeah. And from what I gather, the network layer has historically been the least automated and the least defended part of the enterprise stack. Is that a coincidence, or is there a direct connection between those two things?
That's a great question. I've never kind of thought it that way. I think there are two main issues. People want the network to operate like power and utility, right? They want to plug the network in and just have it work. And the problem is power is very specific, right? It knows it needs to turn on a light bulb. It knows it needs to power to a certain set of standards. Every enterprise has a network that's almost like a snowflake, and many of them have individual snowflakes inside of that, right? They might have a network for their users. They might have a network for their traders, a network for their bankers, et cetera, all configured differently because they generate revenue in different ways. And when you look at the network equipment itself, right, we're still using the same command line interfaces in the majority of devices that we used in 1998, 1996. And so when it comes to automating those complex challenges, it's just difficult. And when you combine that with the fact that 30+% of a configuration on a device is bespoke, meaning unique, then it becomes very difficult to automate unique things. And so there have been other problems that have been more pressing that has kind of moved this out of the limelight. And what's happened is AI has kind of brought it right back to that center.
Yeah. And could you tell us what AI has really made us learn? That's the most vital element of network.
Well, it kind of really pointed out the fact that your network is really a mechanism by which you get at all of your data. And it used to be that you would build a database or you'd build a Hadoop cluster, right? So first we cared about north-south traffic. Then we cared about east-west traffic in the data center because of, numerically intensive computing and Hadoop clusters and things like that. Now the data is everywhere, and AI wants access to that data everywhere it goes. And so now it's not just about how to implement like your compliance and audit controls in a very specific way. Now you have to put them everywhere, and you have to think more holistically. And it sort of takes this whole structured, unstructured data problem that people have been dealing with and brings it directly to the network and mashes it all together. So now your information security team is really kind of getting it from every single angle. They can't really turn any direction without having some sort of serious risk in their face.
Yeah. Now, enterprises are promising customers and investors that AI will accelerate the business without compromising security. Where does that promise break down? Where's the disconnect?
I think based on a couple of things we've already talked about, that disconnect kind of becomes very, very clear. When you are developing applications that sit on infrastructure and that infrastructure is easily repeatable or cloud-based, architecture, it's very easy to roll out patches, migrate traffic, etc. When you deal with a network, you're still at the most fundamental level dealing with voltage on a wire. And that provides limitations around how you fail over, and it makes you think through things a little bit more deeply than you need to. And so the ramifications of that are sort of stratospheric. It's been very difficult for the network to keep up with that. And then on top, and now that it's even faster, the light is really shining on the network and saying, listen, it's not okay for you to do an upgrade once a year. And a once a year was an excellent best practice, right? Now they're saying, hey, you've got to really rethink this approach, and you need to start figuring out how to combat real-time issues in the network, whether it's bugs or vulnerabilities. And that's a step change for the network operators, many of which have absolutely, I wouldn't say absolutely, but very little automation experience.
So I think the question is, how do you bring the network to 2026?
Well, that's a great question. First, I think there's a couple different approaches. There's three different approaches that generally fit in the industry. The first is, buy a tool, right? Whether it's a vendor tool or a tool like Gluware or whatnot, a platform, et cetera. Second is kind of use a legacy NCCM, something that's been around for a long time. And the third is really do it yourself. And every single business needs to take a look at their policies, their standards, right? And then the needs that the network has around AI and make a determination. For old school tools, I won't name names, but for many of them, you'd have to buy a single tool for every product that you buy. Is that okay? Right? Probably not. When you look at platforms like Gluware, we kind of come out of the box to help you solve those problems. And then the third piece is doing it yourself. If you were running an infrastructure stack for, say, a globally significant bank, and your head of network, knowing all these AI challenges, came to you and said, well, if you give me $50 million, I can solve this problem in 3 to 5 years. Would you be okay with that? Exactly.
That's a
No,
challenge indeed.
absolutely. Right. So you've got to think differently. You've got to make some radical changes. You have to say, hey, maybe if I have 60 or 80% of what I need to automate and solve these use cases, let's do that. Let's not wait for perfection. A lot of times, the people I've worked with in the past, many of the customers I've dealt with, they're like, oh, you can do 98 of the things out of the 100 things that I've asked for. These 2 other things happen once in a blue moon every 60th Friday. But since you can't do that, I'm gonna step back and take a different picture. You've got to be able to say 80% is enough. It gets me to where I have to go, and then harden your operational process around what's actually achievable and start moving forward, because incremental progress is important. And if even if you can't get to a 2-week patch cycle on a network or a 30-day patch cycle, a quarterly patch cycle is way better than nothing, right? And so you've really got to start taking those baby steps and forcing yourself to make a change.
Yeah. So change comes incrementally, but absolutely has to be done.
Yes. And the hardest part of that is always going to be culture.
Yes. It's always the soft spaces that actually determine whether change happens.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. So, talking about things that everyone is talking about, right? With recent events, Anthropic's Claude Fable 5 and Claude Mythos 5, is really, everywhere in the news. But from a network security standpoint, what does all this actually expose, and how representative is it of where AI powered threats are heading?
I think it's the wake up call that the industry has not wanted but needed. To be perfectly frank, we do a ton of research behind the scenes to kind of validate marketing approaches and that kind of stuff. And it used to be that attack vectors through the network was a very small percentage of the total. And what we're seeing is that that has significantly started to change. And so now the people who want access to your trade secrets, that want access to your bank accounts, they now know that the infrastructure you use in the network is vulnerable. And now they can find new vulnerabilities based on the trends of old vulnerabilities fast and furiously. And we have always counted on this concept of defense in depth, right? Well, I don't really have to worry about my routers and switches because there's a firewall in the way. But ultimately, there are so many different ways to circumvent some of those components that defense in depth needs to be taken very, very seriously. And it means that you now need to make sure that that infrastructure stack is hardened behind the scenes. And you've got to be aware, and you've got to be able to report, and you've got to be able to do a risk assessment based on those components. And maybe it doesn't have to be the entire network. Maybe you just start with critical areas of the network, the parts that really drive revenue for your business. And you say to yourself, all right, am I following goodness standards, right? Am I following best practices? Okay, great. Well, I'm doing that now. All right, well, now how do I start responding to the singular events that are happening? So just being able to pull the data in, understand what really impacts you, right? You're getting thousands of vulnerabilities a day, maybe not a day, maybe a month, right? And now you've got to be able to say, of these, how many are really impacting me? Right. And that's what's important. Maybe of the 1,000, there's only 60 or 70 that are really a problem for you and your organization based on the state and configuration of your environment. The problem is today, it takes 2 months of gathering data and doing analysis to be able to figure that out. And this is where the main impact, this is where we see the main value of AI coming to bear, because now you get that same data in minutes, right? Risk assessed, scored to your security team. So now you're not in a haze, like trying to figure it out. You're saying to yourself, okay, what is my business? What's important to my business? Okay, information security. Here are the things that are critical to me, and here's the approach I'm going to take to mitigate that. And that, just having the information to get started, is a great first step.
So it sounds like, of course, AI has actually enhanced capabilities. Of course, it's enhanced the dangers as well.
Yeah. And then I think the missing piece is taking action, right? Now you have the information, and now that information can be tied to dynamically fixing the problem at scale.
And so, what's the mindset shift that's really required? That's what it is, right? You have to scale up operations by changing the mind. So, any guidance there?
Yeah, I have a saying that I use a lot. So if anyone's listening that knows me, right? There's this concept of pride of ownership, and then there's a concept of pride of outcome. Many engineers, because of the nature of their love for what they do, they have pride in owning. I own this thing, right? I touch this. This is mine. And I do a great job at managing that. Well, we've kind of reached a point where that doesn't scale anymore. And instead, it needs to be, I helped facilitate this outcome, right? I made this happen for the business, right? And so you're getting out of the fact that you own a widget or a thing or a configuration, and you're saying to yourself, now, how do I facilitate a business outcome that allows all of these devices? How do I build an enterprise service that delivers? And I think that's the big mind shift that has to happen. When you sit at your desk and you write a little piece of automation that's just for you, maybe it upgrades a router, right? That's not an enterprise level service that can be passed on to the next person, that's hardened and ready to be used at 2 o'clock in the morning by someone that's reading a run book. And that's the kind of shift we need to be thinking about. How do you start ingraining these best practices into what you do every day and the outcomes that the business expects? And that's a big mind shift, for a lot of people, but it's key for being able to handle this problem long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's look at maybe the industries. So, which industries face the highest risks, especially from Mythos level AI, and why as well?
Well, initially, anybody that's in the limelight is going to get attention, right? And what's great about where I come from, financial services, is we have a regulating body. The states have regulating bodies that oversee banking, right, and operations. And the result of that is we have policies and standards and baselines that we need to follow that are checked and carried on. So there's a framework there to be able to move forward. And the reason why there's that framework is because they've been traditionally the most vulnerable, right? The richest targets that people have gone after. But I think there's important things that are happening now. You're seeing a big, I would say, growth of that with your healthcare industry, where you've got protected information about people, et cetera. What I would say is any industry that has access to personal sensitive information, including just credit cards and things like that, you really need to be taking this seriously. And why? Now, if you're running a comic book shop, in your local town, you're probably not going to be the big target, right? But having a good sound defense makes sense there, right? Consuming services that help fix those problems. And, the fix for these are those traditional processes, right? Good audit and compliance, making sure your devices are configured correctly. Like, running through the basics helps point the target to someone who isn't handling the basics.
Yeah, I think I come across this over and over again that even if we live in what's the age of AI, the basics are still somehow the most important thing to get right.
Yeah, 100%. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a very recurring theme. Good process control, following through on the things that you say you're going to do, good policy and standards, right? Then you're actually only dealing with the most critical of problems that are coming up today, and your whole life isn't fire drill. And that's when you really see a mature organization, one that's saying, hey, this is a problem, we need to solve it. And they've given themselves the time, the energy, and the financial wherewithal to be able to get that done. Too many of them are running around in circles like, oh my God, what do we do? The sky is falling. And that doesn't help any.
Yeah. So the basics, of course. So I kind of pulled this data that Gluware has cited that thousands of CVEs or common vulnerabilities and exposures are published every week, right? And that 98% go unremediated. Help us understand why. And also, is this a resource problem, a tools problem, or something more fundamental?
Well, I will tell you that just about everybody in the industry will tell you that it's a resource problem. But the fact of the matter, it's not a resource problem. You can't throw endless amounts of resources at something, right? There's a fundamental lack of total service ownership, right? When I bring a router or device into the network, most organizations are not thinking about how do I automate that for a life cycle that begins at implementation, that also includes maintenance, and then includes decommission when the life cycle is over for that device. And so they're picking a router off the shelf that meets their business needs. They're putting it in, and then day two, right? Day one and day two is kind of like, oh, that's operations problem or whatnot. And because the technology itself is old, it lends towards that approach, right? Oh, well, I can't possibly automate, the 15 different router types or the 15 different switch types and the 10 different operating systems that that you're working under. And ultimately, you've got to solve that problem, right? You've got to say, hey, I'm not going to accept that. And the other big problem to this is that people continually think that greenfield is the answer. Oh, I'm going to spend $20 million and now I'm going to buy all this new stuff. And since I'm buying this new stuff, the problem goes away. And the answer is it absolutely does not. The minute you power that on and run traffic on it, that green device becomes brown. And the more non-automated, non-standardized ways of interacting with that device, the further and further it gets from that pristine condition in greenfield, and you're right back to where you started. So you've really got to I've said it a million times, I'm going to keep saying it. You have to stop doing what you did yesterday. The definition of insanity is the joke that everyone always says, right? We're repeating the same behavior, expecting a different outcome. You have to do something different, right? You've got to start taking a look at the problem much more seriously. You've got to think of yourself as, when you run IT, you should think of yourself almost as a service provider, right? I provide services for compute, for networking, et cetera, to a business that consumes them to get an outcome. And you need to treat it that important. You need to be thinking about, if you were the business owner, if you went to, bank.com and you couldn't get access to your money, you would lose your mind, and rightfully so. And people need to be thinking about that in that context. So modernize where you can, right? Automate everywhere, and then be thoughtful about your technology direction so you don't make a mistake that puts you back behind the curve after you've put a huge investment in.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Is there any framework anyone who's setting this stuff up can follow? Like any strategy they can apply?
I think there's quite a bit out there. NIST has always been a great place to start, right? The government provides standards on security and approaches. They've got documentation on AI. If you really don't know what to do, I would absolutely start there. If you find yourself taking over a network, maybe you're new, take a look at the landscape of tools and capabilities that are out there. If Mythos is what you're looking for, find something that meets your patching needs and schedule at the timeline you're looking for. Find technologies there to be enabled. It won't solve everything, but it can get you close. And so you really got to be in tune with what you need to be successful across the whole life cycle of your device, what you're trying to accomplish, and then move towards it. Partnership with experts, regardless of who that expert is always better than trying to solve this problem on your own.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And of course, you've built network and security engineering organizations at some of the most regulated financial institutions in the world. What does that experience tell you about what it takes to move towards safe and autonomous network operations?
Well, it's interesting. One of the big reasons I came to Gluware was I felt like that was one of the things that the industry still needed help with, right? I founded ONUG, I worked in financial services. What was the next, sort of bastion of innovation? I think this is really it. Ultimately, you've got to think through what your business needs from the network, the data it needs access to, the outcomes, right? The availability components, the whole nine. And you need to not operate in a silo, right? You need to be talking to your compute team, you talking to your cloud teams, talking to your AI teams, understanding what their needs are, and not saying like, "Hey, I'm this utility that lives, all alone." And then if you're not in a regulated environment, you can use, New York State DFS controls. You could use, regulated entity controls. You could look at the Cloud Security Alliance. There's lots of places that you can go to get guidance on how to make the best decisions for your network, or go to an industry show, or reach out to someone on LinkedIn. I think there's a whole community out there that can help you answer the questions. The worst thing that you could do is put your head in the sand and say, I'm just going to wait, right? That I can tell you AI is the kind of platform that is going to ruin you if you don't take action. Even if you make a mistake and redirect to the right direction later on, you've got to start getting the organization moving. That's absolutely critical.
Yeah. When you mentioned AI, it's just a very simple and basic question comes to my mind, that in the direction that we're moving, is it possible that we're looking at a future where security is a luxury and not a given because of the capabilities of AI?
Well, that's interesting. I think that way about a lot of things. I spent a lot of time in the military, and I don't think anything is a given, right? I think everything has to be worked towards and accomplished. And what AI will do is it will point out your flaws faster than ever before. Where it used to be that you could get away with 2 or 3 years not doing an upgrade because no one's going to get around to scan you, or because you have some level of firewall protection or other security safeguards. AI is going to figure out right away that you're a problem. And because AI is automating the discovery of that, that the automating of the attacks is right behind it. And so it is AI as a land where security is going to be something that we have to think about every second of every day. And everything that we do, every project that you lay out, every plan that you have needs to have a risk lens associated with it on what happens if you don't make the change fast enough. What happens if you aren't protecting your operating systems? You're not doing the certifications you need to do. You're not doing the UAT testing and validation, et cetera. It's really taking the last 30 years and basically saying that was practice. Now we have to do it for real.
Yeah, and you have to be alert all the time, like in every way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the question that springs to my mind is you said you had some experience in the military, and of course, I see so much military, terminology in cybersecurity. Do you want to give us some idea of, how your experience in the military really helps you here, and in general, how it can help others as well?
Yeah, where it really helped me is I did a medical background in the military, and I did command and control, so it was a little different than IT. But what I can tell you is it helps you to understand the problem, how to build a plan, and then execute. And for folks that are out there looking for talent, I would absolutely recommend you take a look at tech operations, IT folks that have been in theater, dealt with real problems, especially if you're looking for good operational roles. Being able to handle large scale problems that affect life and death, being able to comprehend large amounts of information that's non-standard coming in at any given moment in order to help make decisions and make good decisions on the fly. Those are the kind of people that you want in your pocket, especially as the threat landscape increases significantly.
Awesome. So there's a view in some circles that governance and safety are constraints on capability, that they slow things down. What's your view on that?
Well, when I was an engineer, I hated process and I hated bureaucracy, and it drove me insane. Uh, but now, after I started becoming a manager and then being a senior executive managing large scale organizations, I realized that it's the only mechanism we have to protect the business. And when you look at it that way, all of a sudden the bumps in the road associated with governance, right, start to make sense. You want to make sure you're spending the money effectively. You want to make sure that technology is ready to be deployed, that people are making the right kinds of decisions. So my goal, or what I would recommend is, too much of anything is no good, right? You need to have the foundational capability to understand how your IT services connect together. You need to have a strong enterprise architecture approach so the technology that underpins that connects together, right? Network's not doing something that breaks mid-range, right? Or mid-range isn't doing something that breaks file transfer in the mainframe, right? You've got to have an interconnected component of that. And governance is critical. And now that AI is coming, you need to take that same approach for your data, for the agents that you're bringing into the environment. You need a way to approve and validate. So we do risk and compliance. We do, against all the activities that an individual does, you need to take that same approach to making sure that your agents are doing things and being measured, tracked, and evaluated against that same governance framework. And that way, you're leveraging the skills of the last 30 years to the effectiveness of the new technology. Now, I don't recommend a fear-based approach. I recommend going back to the basics, right? What are my agents going to do? How am I going to validate what they do? How do I put the appropriate safeguards in place to make sure that they don't run wild, right? It's that thought process. And then don't be afraid. If there's a group of people whose job it is to evaluate what you've done from a risk perspective and make a decision, right? Even maybe you automate that process, but having that process protects you and the business, which is critical. I don't see anyone being successful with AI for any large scale enterprise or any real scaled enterprise at all without a strong governance component. Someone someday is going to show up at your door and say, I want the evidence, and it could be under discovery or it could be under an audit, right? And ultimately, you need to be able to answer those questions. And the only way that you're going to ensure that is having a strong governance process.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned agentic AI. Could you kind of guide us a little about the role of agentic AI in maybe the protective mechanism of cybersecurity?
Well, it's interesting, right? When you look at agentic AI, you're feeding data and context, right? And the goal is to get an outcome. Maybe you're just churning through data, or you're doing risk analytics, or the whole nine. AI and cybersecurity, and I'm not saying anything unique or novel here. Being able to munge through the infinite amount of data that exists to understand what the nuggets of wisdom are on where you are vulnerable, where your processes are weak, where the attack vectors are coming from are absolutely critical. If you're not thinking about how that happens. Now, what I am seeing is a trend where everybody's saying, "Well, I need an AI-enabled SOC," right? But the real answer is they might not have a good SOC to begin with, right? And if you don't have a good, strong SOC to begin with, then AI is not fixing your problem. So it's going back to the basics, right? Where's my data coming from? What do I want to understand out of my data? How do I now use AI to get that so that it doesn't take any time, right? That just normalizes itself. And then I move on to the next, okay, what things should I learn about my network and my infrastructure? And then I bring that into AI and just slowly subsuming the way you normally do your event management or your log analytics or any of your security outcomes. What that does is it frees up a whole bunch of time for your people on the ground to start looking at new areas where you haven't been effective, or maybe you just haven't had the time to look. And so as you start to subsume that, you get more with the resources that you have. You learn better insights from the data information that you've already got. And once you've got that in a place where you've got a strong event management layer, then you start saying to yourself, all right, now let's talk about AI-enabled SOC and taking action, right? It's really about building upon where you started before you get to the next level. You can't, you just don't get on a train and appear across the country, right? It takes time to get there, and you need to plan for that journey.
Yeah. Planning and going back to the basics. That seems to be absolutely the mantra.
I'm old now, right? And so everybody tells me that the world has changed, but when we first started in technology, you had to worry about how a system was configured and whether or not there was bus space, on your on the motherboard to be able to transmit data. A lot of those those challenges have changed and grown, but the way you solve them, the way you plan for them, and the way you execute, it's all the same.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that basic sort of way of solutioning, I think, is right the point.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah. So tell us about that. Like, if you were, say, confronted with an attack that happened, what is the basic solutioning model that you would put in place, like, immediately, or how you would set up a process for a team?
Well, the first thing I'd say is if an attack is happening, it's way too late to set all that up, right? You're going to be in firefighting mode. So I certainly recommend starting early. And really it's, let's talk about network specifically, right? Understand your landscape. How many devices do I have? How many different operating systems am I running? How old are they? Where are they in their life cycle management? Are there any critical bugs that would prevent operations from happening normally? What are the CVEs that are sitting out there? Then once you understand that, now you can start building some processes. Okay, how do I rank them, right? What's critical, what's high, what's medium, what's low? And then, all right, let's get the blocking and tackling. Let's start with maybe it's only manual. Let's start getting moving, right? Let's get the machine going. And while that's happening, we're building a process. Here's how we gather that data. Here's how we interpret that data. Here's how frequently we do that. I've now negotiated with my corporate security team on how to read that data, interpret that data, and understand the schedule by which I can deliver by. And then you start bringing technology in that incrementally improves your ability to deliver against that timeline. And so you have a process to understand, hey, you know what? Maybe 10 years is too long to have a device in, right? Maybe I should have gotten rid of it before it went end of life, end of support. But I bet you a lot of folks listening right now still have 6500s in their environment that were put in 2002, right? Or 2004. And so, you've got to really think through how what the outcome is that you want, what the processes are that you need to support them, and then how do you turbocharge that with technology in the middle?
Yeah. I think that will really help just to get that mindset shift as well as to figure out the basics. I'm sure it'll help a lot of people to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. So lastly, let's look to the future. Where does network security go from here? What does the next chapter look like?
I think we're kind of still feeling that out. I think what you're going to find is that if AI is the speed at which we're seeing the threat landscape change, attack vectors change, et cetera, we need to be responsive. And we go through these eras where everyone's living in fear because new technologies come out that's scary. And then there are years where we feel like we've got it licked and we're in a good spot. I think we're in a little bit of a downturn, and ultimately what people need to do is understand what threats are really out there, make sure that they have plans associated with how they're going to handle them. And then maybe if you haven't done it, start thinking about worst case scenarios a little bit, right? Do you have a mechanism by which you'll recover your operations center if something bad happens? A lot of people find out, I'm sure folks have read about this, once an attack happens, sometimes you can't make a phone call. You can't get to Active Directory. If you can't get to Active Directory, then how do you get to your email? How do you communicate, right? And everything is reliant on some of those interconnected systems around identity and access management. And so it's not just about thinking about how to stop it all from happening, but also how do you get the team back together if something bad does happen, and how do you take back the fortress once someone's gotten it.
Yeah, absolutely. It points towards something like a business continuity plan, but for the security space.
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right on.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think that this was definitely an eye-opener about network security and just security in general, with a little bit of a flavor of, military precision as well. So, this is just a very rewarding conversation. And thank you so much for joining us at Enterprise Unlocked, Ernest. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Radhika. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thanks again. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Keep listening to Enterprise Unlocked.
Thank you for joining us for the Enterprise Thought Leadership Podcast. Please do follow us on social media and subscribe for more ideas and insights. Until next time.